Jimmy Carter's legacy. Neoliberal saint. Also, neoliberals suck. Over the last couple of weeks, I have spent a good amount of time thinking about the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter, one of the more overlooked and ignored American presidents. With your kind permission, I will now unleash a deluge of thoughts that I have had about Carter and how his legacy might be used in the coming years. For some time, students of American politics have debated whether the neoliberal era began with Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan. Depending on who is discussing the issue, it is either a damning indictment or high praise. Critics on the left, like myself, see the advent of neoliberalism as having been absolutely devastating to the working class in this country. The right is divided between people who are eager to pin the full blame for neoliberalism on the Democrats on the one hand, and supporters of the neoliberal cause who prefer to credit Ronald Reagan with initiating the neoliberal era. Of course, as I shall discuss in more detail below, Carter's politics don't fit the agendas or priorities of the modern left or right to any significant degree, and it is hard for me to imagine anyone advancing a compelling case that Jimmy Carter deserves to be prominently featured among the great figures of their respective ideological genealogies. However, there is one group which could very well end up trying to lay claim to Jimmy Carter's name and legacy as soon as the 96-year-old slips his mortal coil. The Neoliberal Democrats, that is to say Democrats who are pro-corporate but socially liberal, have been able to hang on to their control of the party, but their overall command over the hearts and minds of average Democratic voters has greatly diminished since the dawn of the 21st century. They could use a moral shoring up. Here I will argue that while there are certainly parallels between Jimmy Carter and the neoliberals who took over the party in 1992, those similarities are largely accidental and superficial. Jimmy Carter rejects the notion that he is or ever was a neoliberal. He views himself as a pragmatist who acts according to what he sees as right at any given time. Interestingly enough, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama seem to agree with this assessment, as they want more credit for themselves, and also don't want to associate themselves too closely with the president who is generally regarded as a failure. I believe that James E. Carter was not so much the bringer of a new paradigm which failed, as a pragmatist who simply lacked an overall strategic vision, who was overtaken by events beyond his control. While self-assessments tend to be inaccurate as the people making them are too emotionally invested in their own lives, I believe that Jimmy Carter is actually correct to say that he was not a neoliberal, any more than he was a man of the left or the right as we think of those positions today. Neoliberals have employed a number of gimmicks to distract from their corporatism and its devastating consequences. In the 1990s under Bill Clinton, the Democrats played to the socially conservative mood of the decade. People at the time supported the damaging crime bill, and now Democrats campaign against this very legislation. From generally liberal to outright woke politics representation, neoliberal politicians today frequently play to identity politics in order to distract from real issues. The Democratic Party loves to produce and promote individuals who represent diversity and have a good story. The party prides itself on being a big tent and incorporating a multitude of perspectives. However, the truth is that the party's goal is to eliminate dissent against corporatism and an imperialist foreign policy, and limit diversity to superficial, physical attributes. Far worse, the corporate wing of the party often counts speeches or public statements as being the equivalent of actions, an intellectual error stemming from decades of overemphasis on discourse due to a universal knowledge of Foucault's writings among everyone in the United States who has attended grad school. So where does the 39th president fit into all of this? Simple. He is universally admired as a person. Even people on the right who see him as an abject failure will allow that he is a good man who tried to conduct himself as morally as possible throughout his long life. As I mentioned above, we live in a time when neoliberal journos frequently conflate words with actions and supposed intentions with accomplishments. Jimmy Carter's presidency is the story of good intentions paving the road to the hell that was the Reagan administration and beyond. Once Carter is dead, and as the struggles of his administration fade from memory, Carter's personal morality can be used as cover for the superficially similar politics and struggles of his successors. Carter, in other words, can be used as a sainted figure who will ennoble and legitimize subsequent corporate Democrats such as Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. You may have noticed that I have specified that Carter must be dead for this process to occur. Let me explain the reason why. Since he left office in 1981 to begin what was destined to become the longest post-presidency in American history, Jimmy Carter has remained his own man, and he has not attempted to retain a stranglehold over the party the way that Clinton and Obama have. Carter has offered both implicit and explicit critiques of his successors, especially when it comes to energy policy and diplomacy. Many of these critiques against Clinton and Obama have come from the left, as the former president's views on a few issues, including money in politics and healthcare, have shifted left as he has aged. Famously against American aggression, Carter has frequently mounted missions of peace against the wishes of the sitting president. He has shown a willingness to meet with dictators, a practice which offends the delicate sensibilities of the foreign policy establishment, even though torture and collateral damage exceeding the actual damage inflicted upon the enemy are totally fine. Yet, there are plenty of other areas where Carter's campaign, dealings with the party, and ideological positions are quite convenient for the neoliberal cause. Let us first consider the weaker possibilities of the left or right trying to claim that they operate in the spirit of Jimmy Carter. Prior to the Reagan and Gingrich movements, which saw the GOP sprint to the right, someone like Jimmy Carter may have held some appeal to voters on the right. He was personally socially conservative, even if he did not want to impose his values on others. Prior to 1980, this was a common enough view among mainstream Republicans, including Gerald Ford. Carter had operated as an integrationist, but only came out of the figurative closet on race in 1970 when the tide was beginning to turn. While some on the right would have pined for the days of segregation in the 1970s, more right-wingers would have simply been content in the knowledge that Carter was not a member of the SDS or something of that nature. Of course, were Carter young enough to compete in modern politics, present-day Republicans such as Donald Trump would hammer him from the left over his relative silence on segregation during the 1960s. Carter was also a fiscal conservative, a position that modern Republicans mostly favor, but only when they don't control the White House, of course. Right-wing populists of the Trump variety most likely would not care for Carter's technocratic rhetoric on curbing inflation and setting a far-sighted energy policy. Ironically, Carter was universally understood to be a populist by the standards of the 1970s. As things currently stand, Jimmy Carter has nothing to offer the right-wing populists, the paleoconservatives, or the neoconservatives. It would take a fairly major shift in the priorities of the right for them to try to salvage and invoke Carter's legacy. The modern left has more similarities with Jimmy Carter than the modern right. But throughout his political life, from his time in the Georgia State Senate to the present day, Jimmy Carter has shown that he is not aligned with the left on some of the most vitally important issues to leftists. Jimmy Carter's main defect from a leftist perspective is that he was at best indifferent to organized labor, a subject we will revisit when we look at the neoliberal claim to Carter. It also took Carter a very long time to figure out why money in politics is a corrupting influence, and even as the man who was first governor and then president at the time of 3 landmark cases empowering corporations, Jimmy Carter, even as late as 2015, only seems to be aware of the problem posed by the 2010 Citizens United ruling when it comes to money in politics. How he has remained so remarkably ignorant of the issue is baffling. Carter was also an advocate of deregulation, and although he mostly avoided making any truly damaging deregulations, he still normalized this behavior for Democrats, leading to, among other things, the Clinton administration's push to repeal Glass-Steagall. Most leftists agree with the neoliberals about representation, that is to say, putting women and people of color into positions of power. Jimmy Carter did this to an unprecedented degree, especially when it came to naming deputy and assistant department heads. Most famously, he appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the U.S. Court of Appeals, thus making her a Supreme Court candidate later on. On foreign policy, Carter is closer to the left than any other Democrat in living memory. However, even this is an uneasy fit, as Carter combined a distaste for regime change wars with being an ardent Cold Warrior and ending détente with the Soviet Union. Carter was, not surprisingly, an advocate of increasing military spending, and it was during the Carter years that many of the iconic weapons platforms of the 1980s, including the B-1 bomber and the M1 Abrams main battle tank, were developed specifically for the possibility of a land war against the Soviets in Central Europe. Of course, Carter's stances on energy independence and environmental protection are deeply appealing to the modern left, and in fact, some of the measures that Carter proposed are more aggressive than anything that the left has put forward in the 40 years since Carter left office. For instance, Carter aimed for fuel efficiency for commercial cars to reach 55 miles per gallon by 1995. The Biden administration just approved a new standard of 40 miles per gallon by 2025. The difference is obvious enough. All things considered, however, Carter is not a neat or particularly good fit for the left. Invoking Carter on environmental issues and energy policy is something that the left should do more. But overall, the left should be cautious with trying to embrace the complicated legacy of Carter, which is inseparable from his own unique perspective and experiences. The group most likely to claim Carter's legacy as a part of their own, in my opinion, are the Neoliberal Democrats. Jonathan Alter's 2020 Carter biography, His Very Best, does advance the viewpoint that Carter prefigures Clinton and Obama in almost every way. An ardent loyalist to the Democratic Party no matter where the blue banner leads, Alter frequently cites parallels between the three post-New Deal Democrats in order to provide a kind of interlocking justification for their decisions. Alter's book also reveals that there is an important divide between neoliberals which is beginning to emerge as they are beginning to crack. Effectively, Alter's purpose in His Very Best is to argue that Carter was a neoliberal who was unaffected by the corruption of later presidents. Alter argues, completely unconvincingly, that neoliberals and corporate Democrats are two different things. Carter was assiduous in his avoidance of entanglement with particular corporations and donors, something that Alter clearly wishes present-day neoliberals would embrace. An influential neoliberal himself, I would not be surprised to see Alter use this book as a launchpad for a movement to reform neoliberalism after Jimmy Carter's death. I doubt that Alter's quixotic idealism, which involves serving all corporations equally rather than showing preference to the biggest donors, will lead anywhere. But I must admit that I find the prospect of an openly neoliberal ideologue trying to sell blue-collar workers on corporate tax cuts, deregulation, and free trade at a town hall without dissembling or using clever wordplay to hide his or her meaning sounds pretty amusing. All that being said, let us talk about what the neoliberals writ large see in Carter and where the parallels between Carter and modern neoliberals do and do not make sense. The powers that be at the DNC seem to only tolerate a diversity of thought on economic issues when candidates are to the right of the party as a whole. Kristen Sinema's recent promise to consult her donors in Arizona before voting rather than acting in the interest of her constituents is typical and something that the neoliberal establishment will defend with incredibly idiotic arguments. People who found Sinema's flippant thumbs down for a $15 minimum wage to be inappropriate were hit with charges of sexism for complaining about her mannerisms. The critique of Sinema from the left, of course, stems from the fact that her vote will keep people in poverty and make their lives materially worse. Jimmy Carter sort of fits the mold of the modern neoliberal argument into accepting endless amounts of bullshit and corporatism from red state Democrats, although it does not excuse Sinema's thumbs down. Carter, who grew up in a landowning family in southwestern Georgia, had no understanding of or sympathy for the labor movement until years after he left office. His defenders, such as Jonathan Alter, chalk much of his tense relationship with labor up to the generally good condition of workers at the time and the abrasive personality of George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO during the early years of Carter's administration. However, the fact is that Carter failed to realize that the backbone of the party was labor. Since Carter's time, as union membership, wealth, and power have fallen off a cliff, the Democratic Party has not been able to achieve anything approaching the level of dominance that it enjoyed in the New Deal era, and it is not a coincidence. If we look at Carter's own thoughts, he made it clear, even in 2015, that he had no interest in the struggles of organized labor, characterizing labor leaders as grasping, arrogant, and unwilling to subordinate themselves to him. This sounds like something Obama might say in a candid memoir, as he very much expects workers to be grateful for whatever crumbs and half-assed efforts he made on their behalf. Carter, who has still not thoroughly educated himself on the history of the labor movement, does not understand that the labor movement got to where it was by not subordinating itself to the Democratic Party and instead making the Democrats work for their votes. Carter has studied the religious right, which only emerged into his understanding in 1979. And he most likely thinks that it is the duty of issue-oriented movements to work tirelessly only to hand over all of their power and prestige to a corrupt political party, which will then subordinate that cause to the interest of big money. This is a view shared by more modern Democrats as well, and in a more explicit fashion. Two recent examples of movements which have had juice and credibility only to turn themselves into Democratic Party apparatuses are the Civil Rights Movement and the Human Rights Campaign, the biggest gay rights movement. Both of these movements automatically endorse establishment neoliberals, ignoring the fact that it was the left which first openly embraced their respective causes, and members of the left who paid a political price to help them get off the ground. At present, civil rights activists are able to extract endless promises and panders, but no substantive action. Hear me now and quote me later. Joe Biden will not engage in a major reform of our criminal justice system to fight systemic racism, or fight against Republican efforts to make it harder to register to vote. He will speak out and pass tiny pieces of legislation which nip at the edges of the problems, while the neoliberal media praises him as the second FDR. As for the gay rights movement, it gained credence with Americans as a whole because queer people are born at random into every household, regardless of geography or partisan affiliation. Through a combination of outreach, wit, and grit, the HRC made sure that acceptance of gay people became the norm in America. Crucially, both Obama and Hillary Clinton waited until public support was at 51% before evolving on the issue. By contrast, someone like Bernie Sanders was speaking out about this issue as early as the 1980s. Now, latecomers to the movement try to lecture early adopters on the left about their language and attitudes. For all of the finger-wagging, there has been very little headway on trans issues even after the larger LGBTQ movement had incredible momentum and success from the late 2000s into the mid-2010s. What happened? Simple. By selling out movements like the HRC to the Democrats in order to create a career for themselves, gay leaders ensured that rather than being a movement with the potential for universal appeal, their movement was reduced to a partisan basis. Now supporting or opposing trans rights is more of a strictly partisan thing than gay rights ever was. Right-leaning people, who may have been won over if the pressure was not coming specifically from the party that they despise, now see this as a power grab by the Democratic Party. As part of their Republican identity, they feel that it is incumbent upon them to resist trans rights and not to use preferred gender pronouns. The general lesson here, just to reiterate, is that activist movements should never marry themselves to political parties, but absolutely must maintain some semblance of independence. Selling out to a party is a one-way street to mediocrity and getting mired in the status quo. Speaking of both class and the primacy of action over empty words, One of Jimmy Carter's chief selling points from a neoliberal perspective is his disinterest in the New Deal. While he did not go full Bill Clinton and declare that the age of big government is over, Carter did distance himself from the legacy of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and not just on the Vietnam War. Carter went so far in his efforts to distance himself from the man who brought us Medicaid and Medicare that he offended LBJ's widow, Lady Bird Johnson, who refused to do a photo op with him even after he called her to apologize. While Carter did not seek to systematically dismantle the institutions of the New Deal, he did heavily imply that New Dealers were far too dependent on regulations, many of which he saw as useless. Carter's defenders point out that his deregulation of brewing led to the craft brew scene in America, one of Carter's definite upsides and an exception to the rule of how deregulation typically just favors the wealthy and well-connected. Jonathan Alter holds up Carter's deregulation of the trucking and airline industries as being monumental if undersold deeds. Carter's deregulation made it easier and cheaper to fly, but air travel is something that workers rarely get to do because the cost is still high. Airlines, precisely because they are poorly regulated and have become more deregulated since Carter's day, can and typically do outsource all of their maintenance work to Mexico, change departure times at a whim, and charge nonsensical extra fees for very basic things, while ever steadily narrowing the size of seats and accessibility to the aisle. As for the trucking industry, Alter and the neoliberals want you to believe that this was a pro-consumer move. Maybe the cost of goods went down a bit. However, it is no longer possible to make a decent living with decent working conditions as a trucker in America. Trucking in the 1970s was a path to a steady paycheck and could quite easily support a family. Today, most truckers are independent contractors. They are forced to meet grueling time schedules, and the lack of regulation means that small-time trucking companies are not required to, and often do not provide, heating and air conditioning for their drivers. Amazon, an extraordinarily wealthy company, sets such insane deadlines that its drivers are forced to piss in bottles, and then chastised and written up if their piss bottles are found later. Another piece of Carter's experience that appeals to the talking points of neoliberals in particular, and blue team cheerleaders more generally, is that he faced a stiff primary fight in 1980. The neoliberal line on this, at least in theory, is that it is wrong and damaging to challenge an incumbent Democrat under any circumstances. Anyone who dares to do so is basically a Republican. If the establishment had any consistency on this point whatsoever, then it would be a position that I merely strongly disagree with. As things stand, however, I regard the argument and those who repeat it as absolute fools. To provide a recent example of establishment hypocrisy, the party was outraged that Bernie Sanders briefly considered a primary challenge to Obama in 2012, and the DNC still holds progressives such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the most utter contempt imaginable for ousting the incumbent Joe Crowley. Both of those challenges, you will note, came from the left. On the other hand, when Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts challenged incumbent Senator Ed Markey from the right, not only was he not condemned by party leadership, he was actively encouraged. Joe Kennedy, a neoliberal who trades on his famous name, received endorsements from Nancy Pelosi and John Lewis, two establishment neoliberals who supposedly believe in loyalty to the party at all cost and frequently bemoan primary challengers. For the neoliberal faction of the Democratic Party, primary challenges in general are supposedly verboten, but in reality, this is strictly limited to challenges from the left. The old-timers also typically hang together, but only when the old-timer is being hit from the left. Markey, at age 74, was challenged by the 37-year-old Kennedy. It is important to understand that anyone promoting the idea that primary challenges from the left are inappropriate or wrong is either A, uninformed, B, unbothered by obvious hypocrisy since the standard is not upheld when the opposite occurs, C, getting paid by the party or its major donors, or D, fails to comprehend that primaries give voters more choices and a chance to express their views on issues that they otherwise would not receive. More democracy is a good thing. In 1976, Jimmy Carter had no serious opponent in the primaries. Scoop Jackson of Washington failed to gain traction, and Carter's ground game in Iowa and New Hampshire was quite impressive. The party, however, wanted to broker the convention in order to deprive the obscure Georgia governor of the nomination, so they continued to send in new entrants. The late-comer Jerry Brown of California won the final 6 states. Carter was just short of a majority, but luckily for him, one of his opponents released his delegates to Carter ahead of the convention to honor the will of the voters. In 2020, the Democrats employed a very similar but more successful version of the strategy to stop Bernie Sanders from winning the nomination. Until Biden got rolling, it looked very much as if a brokered convention was in the cards. In 1976, unlike 2020, the forces opposed to a Carter victory came more from the left than the right. The obstructionists who entered late to try to broker the convention worried that Carter might not represent labor well enough and that his record on civil rights was a bit spotty. Others worried more simply that Carter was a tedious public speaker. Presumably writing prior to the outcome of the 2020 primary, Jonathan Alter's tone when describing the 1976 attempt to dislodge Carter is decidedly negative, although this may be simply a result of his obvious admiration for Jimmy Carter the man. Also, much like his good friend Joe Biden, who was saved by the intervention of Jim Clyburn and Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter in 1976 was only able to staunch the bleeding after he made a racist remark by getting Martin Luther King Sr. to hold a rally for him in Atlanta. As president, Carter returned the favor by appointing a few black people to minor positions of power. Okay, I admit, that part is a direct parallel with neoliberalism in the present. Crumbs for unwavering support. The 1980 primary is a textbook example, according to neoliberals and their useful idiots, of how primary challengers doom a party to defeat. In recent years, this has become an orthodoxy to the Democratic Party, although they are only eager to wrap things up when a neoliberal is in the lead. Prior to Super Tuesday, when Bernie Sanders was in the lead, the establishment was determined to fight it out to the bitter end in order to broker the convention. As soon as Super Tuesday and South Carolina had been decided for Joe Biden, Democratic leaders began to chastise Bernie and his supporters for continuing to persist, even though victory was very much still mathematically possible at that juncture. Using the neoliberal version of identity politics, these hacks went so far as to say that to vote for anyone other than Biden was racist and privileged, since black voters in South Carolina clearly preferred Joe Biden. For the supposed strategic minds of the center, winning is supposed to be everything. If you take a look at the electoral map and have a functioning brain, you understand that while the black vote is indeed incredibly important during Democratic primaries, it is rarely the decisive factor in an election as a whole. It is also worth mentioning that the candidate who won more black votes in the primary in 2016, Hillary Clinton, struggled to get black voters to show up for her in the general election in the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. My point is that you should never try to be too clever by half and pretend that you have a clear path to victory with a candidate who excites no one. But to circle back from 2020 and 2016 to get back to 1980, Carter had disappointed the left by moving right after his initial election. Candidate Carter spoke of something akin to a federal jobs guarantee, and also dropped hints that he might push for universal health care. Once elected, Carter's relationship with Ted Kennedy and the left soured slowly, as Carter revealed that he preferred to fight inflation rather than unemployment, and that he thought that a universal health care system was simply too expensive to seriously consider. Not surprisingly, given that the left felt betrayed, Kennedy was able to mount a reasonably strong challenge to Carter from the left. Alter backed this challenge as a young man, and now considers it one of the biggest mistakes of his life, thus proving that he has led a very boring life. He also excitedly reports that the leader of the UAW at the time also backed Kennedy in the primary, and later came to regret that decision. For whatever reason, Carter, Jonathan Alter, and the UAW president are all convinced that the Kennedy primary was somehow the decisive factor in the 1980 election. The only problem with this argument is that both the logic and the math are incredibly flawed. Reagan won handily in his primary fight, but between 35 to 40% of the party voted for Bush or one of the other candidates in the belief that Reagan was too far right to be viable or to win independence. Bush was foisted onto Reagan's ticket by the RNC, much to Reagan's initial dismay. Reagan's detractors quite literally viewed him as a crazy person, and Bush, during the primary, characterized Reagan's supply-side economics as voodoo economics. The Republicans were not all exactly on the same page, in other words. In fact, as we'll see, there's even a third-party candidate who was one of the former Republican primary contenders who ran specifically to try to attract moderate Republicans who would never vote for Ronald Reagan. On the Democratic side, the fact remains that Carter faced a primary challenger because he had low approval ratings, and he was not a very savvy politician. Both he and his Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, told Americans that they should embrace a lower standard of living. At a time when unions were the sinews of the Democratic Party and the New Deal was its creed, Carter rejected both of those things in both word and deed. Ted Kennedy was little more than a decade removed from Chappaquiddick, where his drunk driving killed a girl. While he did have charisma, Kennedy was not terribly strong overall, and did not strike most people as particularly presidential. It didn't help that Carter ran an abysmal primary campaign from the Rose Garden, trying to act above the fray and treating Kennedy and his supporters with contempt. During the primary, which was very much the fault of Carter for being a bad communicator, not delivering any of his promises, and not understanding the needs of his party, Carter's actions helped to further alienate black voters and labor, who had always been a little bit hesitant about him as a candidate from the get-go. Blue team hacks like to list 1980 among the times when the left supposedly screwed the Democrats. Other examples include 1972, when McGovern won the primary only to get destroyed in the general. An argument which completely ignores how the powers that be in the party refused to give McGovern any real backing once he was nominated. Blue no matter who, unless it's a lefty. Jimmy Carter, by the way, was a major player in the anyone but McGovern movement, saying that McGovern could not win, especially in the South. Carter was right about that, and I support his right to push for another candidate to man the helm. However, I will be shocked if I ever hear a criticism from a neoliberal against Carter for not enthusiastically backing McGovern. In 2000, according to neoliberal mythology, Al Gore had the election won until that damned Ralph Nader came along and fucked everything up. Nader, of course, ran in the Green Party rather than as a Democrat, but apparently it is just as much of a sin against the Holy Party to exercise one's right to run on the third-party ticket as it is to participate in a primary. The argument that Nader cost Gore Florida is bullshit, as the numbers don't support it. What cost Gore the election was the interference of Governor Jeb Bush, Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris, and the activist judges of the conservative-dominated Supreme Court, which ended up voting on the well-known legal principle of, I am a Republican, so accountability and fairness are not things that I value on any level. Had Gore contested the election earlier and more vigorously, he could have potentially pulled it off. As things stand, trying to cast blame on the Naders, Steins, Hawkinses, and Sanders of the world is a move designed to do nothing more than absolve neoliberal morons of failing to offer anything to voters which might get their vote. 1980 is a similar case of neoliberal revisionism. The 1980 primary was somewhat damaging, but frankly, a better politician could have crushed Kennedy rather than only winning his submission on the second day of the convention. The real problem, as we see throughout the Carter years, and especially during the 1980 primary in general, is that Jimmy Carter was a very bad politician. He ended up taking the blame for all of the negative developments of the time, from the Iran hostage crisis to fuel shortages to inflation. Carter's "the buck stops here" philosophy was admirable in theory, but in practice it just made him look weak and incompetent. He had no idea how to spin things. Carter's vision on energy, while extraordinary, offered nothing in the immediate future to American voters. Carter, who was not a stalwart steward of the New Deal, which was very much still the backbone of the Democratic Party, could not and did not attempt to paint Ronald Reagan as a radical bent on destroying the institutions which made Americans healthier, happier, and more prosperous. Reagan campaigned on blind optimism, and Carter, who was intellectually superior to Reagan by miles, lacked the political skill and oratorical ability to humiliate him in the debates. If the election of 1980 were close, and you wanted to make the argument that the rough primary was decisive, I might regard your argument as semi-valid. However, the fact is that there is absolutely no way that some turmoil at the convention accounts for the absolute blowout that was 1980. Carter won only 6 states where 49 electoral votes propelled by an appalling 41% of the popular vote. Reagan cruised to victory at 51%. If Kennedy had run and taken some of the vote as a third-party contender, then once again, the hack "don't primary from the left" argument might finally have a legitimate example. However, the only major independent candidate was John Anderson, a Republican who had competed against Ronald Reagan in the primaries. Anderson was to Reagan's left, but his record was rather conservative prior to the 1970s. He was the living avatar of the angry Rockefeller Republicans who were upset that Reagan had taken over their party and was jerking it to the right. Anderson supposedly won support from liberal intellectuals and college students, as well as angry Republicans. However, and unfortunately, liberal intellectuals are not a large demographic, and it is quite clear that most of Anderson's voters were pissed off moderate Republicans. Also, the 6.6% of the vote that he won would not have put Carter over the top. Also, it was Carter's duty as a presidential candidate to keep his base happy. Also, Anderson's current status as a lefty was based on a steady shift over time, taking decades. And he was not there in 1980. He was somewhere between Carter and Reagan on the spectrum. Also, the gap in the popular vote between Reagan and Carter was 8.4 million votes. Anderson received only 5.7 million votes. Until and unless the purveyors of the 1980 neoliberal myth can show that Carter had a path through the Electoral College, if only Anderson voters, who were clearly disaffected with the two major candidates, had been willing to randomly embrace more stagflation and vote for Jimmy Carter rather than the guy who was the dude from their party, then I highly suggest to the neoliberals that they retire both this example and the talking point as a whole. It is not borne out by logic or by numbers. 1980 is not where you want to go with this example. Let it go. I mentioned before that Carter was not a very good politician. He felt betrayed by voters after he lost in 1980, and he was upset about his defeat for a few years at the least. While there are reasons for his defeat, mostly owing to world events beyond his control and his obvious failings as a politician, Carter's bitterness presaged the bitter blame game that we have seen from other defeated candidates in more recent years. From Hillary Clinton in 2016, who wrote a book and promoted the conspiracy theory in order to absolve herself from blame, to Donald Trump, who simply lied about the election results for as long as he could, ultimately sparking a riot at the Capitol, presidential contenders now, as a rule, tend not to take defeat terribly well. In this sense, Carter is not unique or exceptional. He was a member of the greatest generation who took defeat like a boomer. Just like everyone else who has ever sought the presidency, Carter had enough of an ego to look in the mirror and see the man most capable of governing a country which had 221 million people in 1976. The neoliberals have often seen Carter's post-presidential aloofness as a sign of ego, and Alter thinks that there is something of a cautionary tale to be gleaned from the story. The fact is, however, that Alter and other neoliberals are analyzing Carter from a partisan hack perspective, and in light of consensus orthodoxy. If Carter believes in meeting with dictators, whereas this is out of fashion among current foreign policy advisors, then according to them, he is letting his ego get the better of him and making a mistake. If Carter fails to support the initiatives of Clinton and Obama, some of which he didn't agree with, then he was letting his ego get in the way of his judgment. As I have already disclosed, I think that Carter's approach to diplomacy is superior to the approach to diplomacy which has followed. In general, I find that arguments about ego, personal virtue, professionalism, and other nebulous categories of analysis are attempts by the person making the argument to disguise the fact that they have no actual argument. Is Carter's ego really bigger than that of Bill Clinton, who tried to foist his deeply divisive wife on the country twice? Is Carter's ego really bigger than that of Barack Obama, who was so desperate to go down as a great negotiator that he put forward a grand bargain to Speaker of the House John Boehner, where he offered to give the Republicans their pipe dream of privatizing Social Security in exchange for legalizing gay marriage, raising corporate taxes by a few percentage points, and a bag of reduced sodium potato chips. It is also worth mentioning that both Clinton and Obama spend a great deal of their time and energy pushing the careers of their former staffers and toadies. Both former presidents have proven themselves willing and able to intervene in primaries, trying to tip the scales in favor of candidates whom they support. Carter, by contrast, has been rather shy about his views over the years. In 2016, he happened to mention in passing that he voted for Sanders, but he did not go around and actively campaign, as he rightly saw this as an inappropriate use of his prestige and influence as an ex-president. It is not too hard for me to imagine some neoliberal hack writing a cautionary tale about Carter as the proverbial discontented ghost, bewailing the end of his presidency and wondering about Washington. Someone who is disruptive because he follows his ego and tries to achieve peace even when the current president has no interest in peace. Of course, after January 6, 2021, there is a new standard of what constitutes outrageous egotism, and it is an example that Democrats of all stripes will no doubt cite again and again and again. As with the primary challenges, the truth is that the neoliberal standard for an ex-president's involvement is that the ex-presidents should support establishment policies and politicians at all times, no exceptions. If in the process they are able to protect their own legacies and win victories by getting their favorites into positions of power, that somehow doesn't count as ego, because their chief deputies and admirers are the writers of most of the major columns in legacy media. Do you see how it works? Is it not magical? At present, the Democratic Party has an age problem. Most of its major leaders are aging and their abilities are declining. Within the next decade or so, Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, and other leaders of the old guard of the establishment will all, or mostly all, be dead or retired. At that point, Generation X and millennial leaders will step in. If these younger leaders are fans of identity politics, then they will honor the neoliberal tradition of opening up a new front for distraction by focusing on age. They will blame the boomers as they attempt to reproduce the same policies without substantive changes and hope that no one notices the obvious attempt at misdirection. Due to the advanced stage of the current crop of leaders, Democrats do not pursue the generational gap much, since it would require boomer leaders to admit that they're old. Once they're gone, however, Democrats will see that the boomer demographic is shrinking, and also tends to vote red, and that younger generations are becoming more politically relevant with their larger numbers and growing participation as they themselves grow older. It is unlikely that our major problems will magically get better or vanish. At this point, everyone knows that America has made little to no progress since about 1980, and also that the boomers seized power early, presided over most of the period since 1980, and that they will only relinquish the brass ring when it falls off their liver-spotted fingers. The new crop of post-boomer neoliberals might very well find a use for St. Jimmy as a way to bash boomers. Carter, a member of the greatest generation, is literally old enough to make Biden seem young, as a recent photo op demonstrated quite eloquently. However, Carter famously has stated that he does not understand his boomer children and cares more about what his grandkids think of him than what his children think about him. It is also apparent from his messaging as a candidate and as president that Carter has never at any point understood what boomers want or value. I can all too easily see a smarmy neoliberal writer at the New York Times in 10 years turning Jimmy Carter into an honorary millennial, and someone who foresaw the boomer problem years before anyone else. While this might not be entirely disingenuous, it would require a great deal of creativity and adding some heavy extrapolations to create anything like a full argument for Carter as a dedicated anti-boomer. It would also beg the question of why Carter was not more explicit on this issue during his long life. But of course, journalism does not encourage the kind of thinking which leads one to inquire into obvious corollaries. The final area where Carter could be said to prefigure neoliberal politics is that he was extraordinarily adept at courting celebrity support. Not only was Carter very popular with Southern celebrities such as Willie Nelson and Greg Allman, but he later expanded his circle to include many of the biggest names in Hollywood and on the music scene, at a time before Hollywood was so heavily dominated by the Democrats. Of course, much of this owes to Carter's appeal as a dark horse populist from the South in an era where audiences loved underdogs and when the South had failed to produce many national figures known for something other than racism. Since Carter's time, it has become standard for Democrats to receive the support of an overwhelming majority of famous people. Some of this owes to Carter's quirks, which tended to appeal to eccentrics, and some of it is due to both the distaste that Nixon left in people's mouths and the fear of Reagan's radicalism. Reagan, a Hollywood actor himself, left a bad enough impression on his fellow actors to turn Hollywood blue. Establishment Democrats love to roll out footage of testimony from random celebrities about how great a candidate is. The practice, to me at least, does not seem to be neoliberal per se, but rather opportunistic. I believe that Reagan's social conservatism is what made Hollywood turn blue over the last 4 decades, rather than anything Carter did. Carter's celebrity appeal was something very much particular to himself. Of course, if the neoliberals want to claim that this is yet another component of their genius approach to politics, and that it originated with Carter, I won't protest too much because I don't care. Celebrity endorsements don't tend to have much of an impact in either primaries or generals. And now we get to some areas of Carter's legacy where even the most determined neoliberal hack would have a hard time trying to make the square peg fit into the round hole. What enduring power and influence that Jimmy Carter possesses stems from his reputation for personal morality and incorruptibility. While Governor and candidate Carter did indeed have some rich friends who gave him plane rides and other things, they did not represent major industries or ask him for special treatment. Carter has a lifelong tendency to befriend eccentrics, and for whatever reason, eccentrics found Jimmy Carter to be magnetic. Rather than living in awe of major corporate donors, Carter instead approached things in a highly technocratic fashion. He ended up siding with bankers and conservative economists on inflation due to hearing arguments, not campaign contributions. When it came to energy policy and environmental protection, Jimmy Carter could not have possibly given less of a fuck what the oil and gas lobby wanted. While he was typically in line with conservationists on protecting the environment, he rejected their fears of nuclear energy and relied instead on his experience as a part of Rickover's nuclear navy. The influx of corporate cash since the 1980s has led Democrats to officially remove trust busting from the party platform, deregulate finance, allow the deregulation of the energy market, agree to free trade deals which ship jobs overseas while lowering wages at home, and to agree to endless increases in military spending regardless of whether there is anything like a clear and present danger to America's national interest. As president, Carter was so worried about ethics in a post-Nixon world that he put his peanut farm and mercantile business into a blind trust. This business had no real reach outside of western Georgia, and there would have been few if any chances for Carter to grease his own palm with federal contracts. After he left office in 1981, Carter diverged from his predecessor Ford and all of his successors in not taking up any corporate board gigs or delivering speeches to corporate interests to tell them how great they are. For this reason, he is the poorest ex-president. Where Carter agrees with corporate interest, it is never because he personally benefits from doing so, but out of genuine conviction, no matter how misguided. Thus, the true legacy of Carter when it comes to dealing with corporations would be embarrassing to the neoliberals, so they would need to misrepresent it in order to make it useful for their nefarious ends. Once again, it is vital to understand that Carter's name will not be invoked for much until he is dead, so that he cannot clap back. However, if Carter does die prior to 2024 and Donald Trump tries to make a comeback, I have no doubt that Democrats of all stripes will invoke St. Jimmy as an anti-Trump. Carter, as I mentioned, was almost excessively scrupulous when it came to his peanut farm. Trump, by contrast, violated the Emoluments Clause, shamelessly made it known that he expected foreign dignitaries to stay at his hotels, forced the Secret Service to pay for space in the Trump Tower to protect his sorry ass, and did the absolute bare minimum to divest himself from his company. By contrast with Trump, Jimmy Carter looks fantastic. If only more people were willing to open their eyes to the ethical deficiencies of Reagan, the Bushes, Clinton, Obama, and Biden, they would also see that Jimmy Carter makes all of them look like shit as well, at least in that regard. The other inconvenient truth of Jimmy Carter's life, which makes him a less than ideal candidate for neoliberal sainthood, is that his political views continued to evolve over time, and that most of this evolution took him left. One of the key policy objectives of neoliberal Democrats is to avoid a single-payer healthcare system. As president, Carter said that while universal healthcare was an admirable goal, it was simply too expensive. At that time, Carter was obsessed with balancing the budget and curbing inflation, two things that Obama also used as excuses for his own inaction. Carter, however, has since changed his mind. In 2017, Carter co-authored an article and said that the lack of a universal healthcare system in America should be considered a, quote, national scandal. Naturally, since Carter said something contrary to neoliberal desires, this article was not widely circulated or cited. Had Carter written a piece explaining why Medicare for All is a bad idea, on the other hand, it would have been widely published and then used as a cudgel in the 2020 Democratic primary debates by neoliberal goons such as John Delaney, Michael Bennet, and John Hickenlooper against Bernie Sanders. Jonathan Alter, who explicitly calls Carter a New Democrat on several occasions despite pointing out the problems with such an identification, says on page 338 of his book that at the start of his presidency, Carter had to choose between being a, quote, lunch bucket Democrat or a, quote, New Democrat, and that he wisely made the same decision that Clinton and Obama made later, i.e., embracing being a New Democrat. The fact is, however, that while Carter embraced some liberal policies as the nominee, he ran in the primary mostly as someone who wanted to move beyond the New Deal. He never had any intention whatsoever of being a lunch bucket Democrat, and he did not embrace being a New Democrat because that was not an established category of analysis at the time. Carter grew up as a landowner, and his father had the political connections to get him into Annapolis. In absolute terms, the Carters were not rich, but they were prominent in Plains, Georgia, and at no point in his life did Jimmy Carter have any compelling reason to consider himself working class. By contrast, Bill Clinton grew up poor in Hope, Arkansas, and relied upon scholarships to go to college. He famously promised that he would feel the pain of Americans who were struggling, and this was appealing to people who were struggling in the mini-recession of the early 1990s. Clinton did not campaign as a leftist, but he did his utmost to come across as someone who cared about the plight of the poor and who would defend the working class. Instead, as president, he slashed welfare, deregulated Wall Street, and signed NAFTA into law. Obama ran as someone who had also grown up poor and had struggled in his life to make it to where he was. On the campaign trail, Obama could make himself sound like a champion of labor, and he explicitly denounced outsourcing and income inequality. He promised much-needed reforms, including a public option to fix America's preposterously broken healthcare system. As president, Obama did the bare minimum to keep the country afloat during the Great Recession, even though he had a supermajority in Congress and could have accomplished a great deal more than he did. Rather than pushing for the public option as he had promised, Obama instead gave his blessing to Senator Max Baucus of Montana, a Democrat and literally the most corrupt and pro-corporate senator in 2009. Baucus was entrusted with writing the entirety of Obamacare, and at the outset of the process, he removed the public option from the bill on his own initiative. With no input from anyone else, Obama did not balk at this decision and did not try to convince him to put the public option back in. Obamacare turned out to help a little bit by requiring insurance companies to continue supporting people who got sick. But it was mostly yet another giveaway to the healthcare industry, a la George W. Bush's Medicare Part D, which did not allow the federal government to negotiate drug prices and allowed Big Pharma to set whatever price it chose. By contrast, Carter, who made no promises and made it clear that he held labor in quiet contempt, did far less damage to the economic interest of the working class than did Clinton and Obama, both of whom ran as candidates who understood pain and suffering and were supposedly champions of the downtrodden, rather than mere symbols for a restored moral confidence. The real elephant in the room when it comes to Jimmy Carter from the perspective of the Neoliberal Democrats is that Carter ran explicitly as a populist, both as governor and as president. Yes, Carter was the P word. Not coincidentally, Jonathan Alter's 600-page-plus biography neatly avoids this fact. Populism was a highly successful political styling in the 1970s, and it did not bear negative connotations. Contrary to what neoliberal journos have written since the rise of Trump, there is nothing inherently right-wing about populism. Carter told his supporters to call him a populist, specifically because he wanted to avoid labels such as liberal or conservative, which might turn off other voters. However, as Thomas Frank notes in his book on populism, Carter used populism simply as a styling, and was hardly attempting to reproduce any of the politics of William Jennings Bryan. Frank argues that it was under Carter when populism shifted from being support for a racially inclusive economic democracy to simply a style of speaking and presentation involving plain speech, blue jeans, and the claim of personal humility. For context, Richard Nixon, George McGovern, and Ted Kennedy, all of whom were different from Carter and from each other, also self-identified as populist. Carter, of course, governed as a technocrat, and was arguably the most technocratic president ever. This is something that the neoliberals will eat up with a spoon, all the while ignoring that technocrats can't win elections, and that this clashes with their electability arguments. Alter's solution of simply ignoring the problem of Carter's populism is probably the wisest approach for the neoliberals. Carter, as I mentioned much earlier, ran on the nebulous promise of helping to heal America's soul after unethical behavior by Richard M. Nixon. This is one area where the neoliberals have taken Carter's context-specific campaign gimmick and tried to make it universal. There are people, all of them absolute clowns, who believe in the idea of the generic Democrat. This is a mythical candidate who is just a plain vanilla Democrat who lies at the median point of the party and offends no one within the party coalition. Ideally, this man or woman has no truly unique stances or ideas, has a medium amount of experience, including one high office, and is in the prime range for a presidential candidate, so not too far removed from age 55 or so. The problems with this are obvious, but I will state them anyway. Such a person does not and cannot exist, as everyone is a product of a time and place with individual experiences, traits, and quirks. Second, every time that this strategy has been employed, it has failed barring extraordinary circumstances. In 2000, Gore ran as Clinton's successor, and so did Governor George W. Bush. There were few differences between the two candidates. Gore excited no one, and got robbed after he failed to elicit enough support to put the race out of reach. John Kerry, a war hero who became a Vietnam protester and then married the heiress of Heinz Ketchup, eschewed his fascinating life's journey in favor of being bland and generic in 2004. Speaking one syllable at a time, Kerry promised to do the same things as Bush, but to do them better. There was no indication of passion or purpose, and Kerry's campaign felt flat and lazy. There was no indication, he had no new ideas and offered no changes in direction. His whole campaign was premised merely on the notion that he was a more competent version of George W. Bush, who was notoriously dumb. In 2020, Joe Biden ran as the default candidate and reproduced some of Carter's rhetoric about the soul of the nation. Both men are mediocre speakers, and none of this rhetoric had any wow factor to it whatsoever. In 1976, Carter ran a vigorous primary campaign and came across as different than other politicians. The novelty factor and his promise of personal decency had appeal in that context because of the fresh pain of Richard Nixon. In 2020, Biden would have lost to Trump if not for the COVID-19 pandemic, and more specifically, Trump's bungled handling of that pandemic. A number of the older voters who proudly backed Trump in 2016 voted for Biden in 2020 instead because they feared losing their lives to a deadly pandemic that Trump clearly did not know how to manage with any degree of competence. I have no doubt that the neoliberals will continue to promote the generic Democrat idea into the future. I have even less doubt that it will continue to fail and that the neoliberals will continue to blame voters rather than faulty candidates and stupid strategies. The grand old men Clinton and Obama can't change that. The semi-senile Joe Biden can't change that. And even the saint-to-be Jimmy Carter will not be a powerful enough bludgeon to shame voters into continuing to support shit-tier candidates who offer up absolutely nothing of value. This decade, I have little enough doubt, will see the promotion of many misinterpretations of Jimmy Carter. Here's the truth about the 39th president. Joe Biden is the first president of Carter's long post-presidency who worked with him as a candidate and president, and with whom he has a real relationship. There is a very good chance that Biden will make use of Carter's legacy in an unprecedented manner, possibly even with the blessing of a still-living Jimmy Carter. Carter was a centrist, but he was not a neoliberal. Carter had no hard and fast ideological principles. Although he was less political than many, he was still very much a politician who was willing and able to do publicity stunts to attract attention. From canoeing on the treacherous Chattahoochee River a mere year after Deliverance made the river known to the public, while governor, to installing solar panels in the White House as president, Carter did understand the power of gestures. Carter's strategy in the 1976 primary was brilliant, and he managed to emerge with the win despite the antipathy of the party and a severely damaging gaffe. This does not mean that he was a particularly skilled politician, however. Carter was a poor communicator whose speeches are sleep-inducing. As someone who was indifferent to the New Deal, he did not realize that people need something to be hopeful for and aspire to. In general, despite being a nice guy who intended well, and whose engineering background made him adept at understanding the inner workings of machines and institutions, Carter was completely clueless about what made other people tick. His primary victory in 1976 was due to a masterful strategy at a time when most politicians were unclear on how to approach a primary. He won the general election because Ford pardoned Nixon and then abandoned Nelson Rockefeller, who could have gotten some of the Union and black voters who did not trust Jimmy Carter to represent them. Carter did not understand that his subordinates needed positive feedback from time to time. Carter did not understand that he needed a solid base of support and that it was his duty as president to also be a party leader. Despite being incredibly farsighted on energy and foreign policy, Carter had no overall vision. His presidency was not a failed realignment because his vision was not comprehensive enough and his control of the party not secure enough to allow for anything like a realignment. The truth about Carter is that we can learn a great deal from his experience, but that most of the examples that we will glean will be negative, i.e. things that we should not emulate. As I have stated, I am in favor of Carter's ideas on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and diplomacy. There are areas where the example of President Jimmy Carter are quite valuable. When it comes to Carter's post-presidency, his avoidance of big money, and his excellent work diplomatically and especially in the Third World, what it shows is that Carter had a sincerity about him that is distinctly lacking in all of his successors. Carter genuinely did care and did attempt to make the world a better place. His successors may well have cared a little bit on a few issues, but not one of them was anywhere close to being as sincerely committed to making the world a better place. In fact, it is my belief that Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Shrub, Obama, Trump, and now Biden are first and foremost concerned with themselves, and that any good that they might accomplish along the way is simply a bonus. If we're going to make Jimmy Carter into a political saint, it should not be as an ideological or partisan figure, but rather as someone who did his honest best whatever that entailed. If someone were to come along with Carter's ethics, but frankly more political ability, then that person could indeed be a transformative figure in our troubled nation's history. The debate over Carter's legacy, I realize, is not the most pressing issue in the world. However, it does lie at the intersection of most of my major interests: politics, history, memory, and narratives. Thank you all for indulging me while I inundated you with my thoughts on this admittedly obscure matter. I am Spirit of Thersites, doing my utmost to make sure that no stone is left unthrown.